Hi, today we're going to make a cutting board. Why? Because they make great gifts. What mother wouldn't love to get one on Mother's Day? Plus they're super simple and fun to make. This is a project you can accomplish in a weekend, easily. I'm going to show you how I do it, and I'm also going to tell you when I use a certain tool what you may use in place of it in case you don't have that. I've made tons of these, probably 50 or 60 of these over the last few years. And as I've gotten better tools, I've moved on to easier ways of doing it. But you can do this with a basic shop. So we're going to step through this and see how it's all done. Let's go. Process is to make sure that all of our wood is completely flat. I have to run mine through the thickness planer because I either get rough cut wood or wood that is of various thicknesses. If you buy your wood from a big box store, you could probably skip this step because chances are it's going to be consistent throughout. Next, I take the wood to the joiner to get myself one clean edge. I use that edge when I'm cutting strips on the table saw. Also, it's either going to be the top or bottom of a board, so I want the thickness to be the same all the way through. So as long as I got one clean edge, all my cuts are going to be consistent throughout. My cutting boards end up being approximately 1 inch thick at the end of this process, but to get there we need to cut strips of 1.25 inches thick. Doesn't matter how thick those boards are, but when we cut 1.25 inch strips, we're going to be able to turn them on edge to get a consistent 1.25 inches all the way through the board. So all those boards that we just flattened and gave a true edge to, we're going to cut 1.25 inch strips out of each one of them. We've talked about the final thickness of boards that we like to shoot for. Now let's talk about the length that I look for. Typically my boards end up around 15 inches long. So we start off by cutting all of our boards at 16 inches. That way at the end we can make a final trim and it'll be close to 15.5. As you can see, I'm cutting all these boards here in sets. That's because they came out of the same board. I like to keep them together because then you're going to have the same thickness and the same color pattern. It'll be easier to put your boards together when we lay it out. Alright, now that we've got the majority of our cutting finished, I kind of wanted to regroup, show what we've got, why I've got it laid out this way. Right now, we have all of our walnut right here, we have our maple here, purple heart, and our wenge. Of course, our walnut and maple are domestic woods, easy to come by, and this is going to be the bulk of our project. Purple heart and wenge are an exotic species, quite a bit more expensive, especially the wenge. So I'm not going to use a lot of it. I'm just going to use a little bit to accent, just to give it some cool looks at it. And you can see here the maple's a lot less than a walnut. The bulk of our wood's going to come from the walnut. Maple is going to be kind of just to break up the dark colors and accent these over here. So you can see I got them stacked up. Maple all came from one piece of wood. I know it's all the same color. Purple heart came from one piece, all same color. Same with the wenge. Now, you can see with the walnut here, we've got a ton of different colors, different shades, different grain patterns. These came from all different kind of boards I had laying around. So what I did is each time I took a board, I cut it, then I cut it to length, and we did everything, cut it to length, kept them together. That way this group of wood all is very similar. So if I'm going to use it, I want to make sure that I put it on one side and put one on the other side. And that way we're going to have a consistent, even flow. Now, you can stop right here and just glue your board up and have everything about the same thickness. I've seen plenty of people do it, especially if you're selling it at craft fairs and stuff. They sell fast. But I like to give mine just a little bit more interest, a little more pop, keep every single one unique. So what we're going to do now is we're going to take some of these, start laying out a pattern, and then we're going to cut some of these thinner than what they are. So we're going to have not only different colors and have a pattern, but we're going to have different thicknesses along the way too, to really give it some interest. So let's start laying this out, and then we'll go make some cuts on the table saw to make them thinner. Now table saw can be a dangerous activity. If you try making your thin strip cut between the blade and the fence, you could have a kickback potential. And believe me, if you've ever been there, you never want to be there again. So I'm using a thin rip table saw jig, which allows the thin strip cut to be outside of the table saw blade, not pinched between the fence. Now this thin rip table saw jig looks a lot like a feather board, but it has a ball bearing at the tip of it, and it allows the wood to slide through. And every time you make a cut, if you want to make another cut on that same piece of wood, you just slide the fence toward the saw blade till the stock bumps up against that ball bearing. If you notice, the ball bearing is in front of the table saw blade and not behind it or even with it. So make sure you set this up correctly. But this is how I make all my thin strip cuts. So now that after we cut those thin strips, we can place our board and lay it out. And if you can see right here, I've got it, everything's symmetrical. I start off with the middle, kind of give it a racing stripe. I'm using that really expensive wenge wood right in the middle. We have two more matching pieces of walnut, followed by two maples, purple heart and maple. So that's another set on each side. I have book matched pieces of figured walnut right here. So you can see they're kind of lining up at an angle. Followed by wenge wrapped in maple, then walnut, and purple heart. So now the next step is to glue this up. From here on out, it's going to get uglier before it gets better. So let's go ahead and glue this up. Just thought of some things that we need to talk about before actually gluing this down. This will make your life a lot easier if you follow these steps. First off, if you don't have a thickness planer or drum sander and you're going to resort to a belt sander or a random orbital sander or a hand plane or something like that to get this to its final flatness, you're going to want to pay particular attention to how well these boards get all lined up when we glue them, when we squeeze them together. You want to make sure they're as flat as possible. You want to clean out any glue squeeze out that you're going to have. All these things you're going to have to take a little bit of attention to get to your final product. With a thickness planer and a drum sander, you can go right through it and it's not much of a hassle. So think about that if you're going to go with, if you don't have a thickness planer. Also, let's talk about the glue. I'm using Titebond 3 glue. The reason being is Titebond 3 is waterproof. So when you're going to be hand washing your boards afterwards, or you get juices on it, you don't have to worry about that affecting with the glue up bond. Titebond 1 is not waterproof. Titebond 2 is not waterproof. Titebond 2 sets up extremely fast. Titebond 3 has a longer open time. So that gives you more time to get this board all lined up and squeezed. It doesn't start setting up on you right away. And we're really no hurry because after we get it clamped up, we're going to let it sit for 24 hours anyway. So I just use Titebond 3 for everything now because this is just my favorite glue. All right, clamps. What kind of clamps are we going to use? You can use a pipe clamp. You can use a bar clamp. You can use parallel clamps, which is what I use all the time. Anything that's going to keep it straight. You don't want to use those trigger clamps or pistol clamps, whatever you call, because when you squeeze those tight, it's going to shift everything and you're going to end up making this out of whack. But so what I like to do is make sure my pipe clamps or bar clamps or parallel clamps are ready to go. I've got them all the way out. I've got them opened. I've got them right here next to me so I can use it. That way I can go from step 1 to step 2 and not have to stop and worry about setting up. I've had it before and it makes it more stressful than it needs to be. If you take these couple extra minutes, you'll be fine. Another thing is you're going to have glue squeeze out. So you can either take saran wrap or parchment paper and put it down underneath of this so that you have all of your glue contained. I don't worry about that. I have an epoxy top on top of my workbench here. So I just have myself a bucket and sponge ready. And I clean up the glue right after I'm done. And it makes life simple. So now that we know that we have everything we need all set up, now we got to get ready to glue. So what we need to do is we're going to take all of our pieces and we're going to flip one at a time. Slide them down. Because these are the order that they're going to go in, and these are the edges we're going to glue. You're going to see you can end up taking up quite a bit of space with a simple 12-inch board. The more pieces you have, the longer it takes, the more area it takes. I think my biggest one has been right around 37 pieces, or just under 40, I believe. Now, your last piece, leave that standing upright. We are not going to glue this last piece. So, now, you can put glue on however you want, but you need to spread it. And what I've typically done in the past is I've used acid-free brushes, use them a couple times and throw them out. But I just picked up this little nifty glue roller from Rockler, and it's going to speed this process up quite a bit. Now that we've got all the boards fully covered, what we're going to do is flip one, flip the next one with the dry end to the glue end, and proceed all the way across. Try to make sure we keep the bottom and top realigned. This is one of the reasons why I like to cut them just about an inch longer than what my final is going to be, or up to an inch longer, is because it's easy to line up the top and bottom here. I've done it before where I've had, you know, all kinds of lengths. It might be 2 or 3 inches longer than the others. And then we end up with the top and the bottom. The bottom's going one way, top's going. And then we end up snipping more than we really need to at the end. Kind of wasteful. Alright, halfway done. This is why we spend so much time at the beginning making sure all the boards are flat and clean and the same thickness, is because this process becomes a lot easier. We don't have shifting boards, we have a consistent finish. So now what we're going to do, slide this down to the end for me. Take a bar clamp, pipe parallel clamp here, and I'm just going to clamp it down, right down the center. Make sure it stays down. Now I can flip it up. When you get a longer board, when you get into the 20 inches or so, it becomes a lot more difficult to keep it from bowing when you stand it up. These 12-inch boards seem to stay up real well. As you can see, I got a little glue out coming, squeeze out coming on. Shift this board down, this pipe clamp down. I use parallel clamps all the time, and the reason being is it gives you a nice, straight, even clamp. It keeps everything lined up, and you can put a ton of pressure on it. Now, as you can see, we got a lot of squeeze out going on. Not terribly bad. This roller worked well. I've had a lot worse by using a brush. This worked out fairly well. If you don't have the thickness planer, this is the time where you're going to want to clean as much of this glue up as you can. Take a wet rag, whatever you want, or you can let it dry and use like a junk chisel or something like that to scrape off the beads. But the more glue you got, it's going to load up your sandpaper if you have to go to with a sander, and it's just going to take you more time. So for me, I'm going to be going to thickness planers with this next, so I'm just going to set this off to the side on a piece of cardboard and let it dry. Alright, I let the parallel clamp sit overnight, and I've taken the board out of the clamps. Right now it's got some glue squeeze out, looks pretty ugly, and from here on out it's just going to continue getting better looking. While I was thinking about it last night, there was a couple things I wanted to touch on. First off, you don't need to let it sit overnight. I believe with the Titebond 3 they say 45 minutes. The glue is set, but you're not supposed to work with it for quite a bit of time after that. So usually I just let it sit overnight. I'm sure after a few hours you could go ahead and start working with it, because we're not doing any real twisting and prying. We're not going to be jeopardizing the joints. Now, the one thing last night that kind of struck me is I went over on how to do this with the parallel clamps and how I do it, but I forgot. For years and years I'd been using pipe clamps. So I wanted to touch upon that. You actually clamp it up a little bit differently, and I just wanted to give you a quick overview of how that's done. First thing I like to do is set the clamps out, open them up, and let them sit there. Then I take some, like I said, plastic wrap or parchment paper, and I like to run those right over top of the pipe clamps. Keeps the glue off the clamps. And also, if you've ever used glue and wood in pipe clamps, you'll know that the color from the pipe clamps can bleed into the glue and into your wood. So basically lay your plastic wrap out so you've got your pipes covered. After that, you just go through gluing the edges like I showed you before. Line them up. And this is a nice way of making sure they stay flat too. And you can have them all glued up like this, or laid out. Slide your pipe clamps over, your stops. And this is an easy way to make sure everything stays lined up. From there you can just make sure everything's flat, as level as possible, and then crank down on them. Very simple. You may have to alternate the clamps so they don't run into each other. And then like the other ones, you just let it sit. Pipe clamps are great for this job. I've just grown accustomed to using parallel clamps. But these would be the two clamps of choice for me on gluing up a cutting board. So now we're going to get into making this thing look pretty. The first step I'm going to take to making this board finished is running it through the thickness planer. That's going to take out all of the uneven surfaces and the glue. It's going to get it down to almost a finished thickness. Now you can do the same thing with a drum sander. It's going to take a long time, and if you've got a drum sander you probably already have a thickness planer. You can also do it with a belt sander. Now this is how I did my first couple boards, and it takes a good amount of time, especially if you're going to have one or two of your boards out of whack, and it's going to take a while to get that even. And I don't think you can ever get it perfectly flat, but with a belt sander you can do a pretty good job. So don't let this step scare you off. After running my cutting board through the thickness planer, I like to take it over to the drum sander and run it through at 150 grit. Now this is by no means a necessary step. If you don't have a drum sander, that's fine. You can still finish everything off with the random orbital sander at the end. I just like to do it this way because it speeds the process up a little bit. But like I said, by no means is this necessary. To the end. What we need to do now is get us to the final length that we want to be. What I usually do is just trim off any of the stragglers and make the ends even. You can cut it to whatever length you want at this point. If you want it 15 inches, take a ½ inch off on each side. Otherwise, just trim it up and we'll move on to the next step. Right now it's time to put an edge profile on our cutting boards. I'm using a router table with a 3/8 inch round over bit with a bearing on it. Now you can do the same thing with palm routers or any other router that you have. As long as you've got that ball bearing, that bearing router bit in there, it'll run along the edge and it'll give you a nice round over. 3/8 will work very nicely. You could probably go to ½ inch, but I wouldn't go any more than that. So now we have the edge. This next step here is optional. You don't need to do this step. What I'm doing here is I'm going to be adding juice screws to this board. I've been having a lot of requests for it lately, so I made this quick, simple jig for it, and it works really well. If you don't want to do it and you're happy with the results here, which I think look beautiful, just move on to the sanding portion of this video, and then we'll show you the finishing. But Otherwise, I'm just going to show you how to put a juice groove in. And what I got here, just a scrap piece of wood, some 2x4s that I have screwed down to this wood. I have 2 of them in place right now. And what I do is I take the board, I fit it against the edges of those 2. Now, at this point, we're going to be adding more to it. But the layout, the thought behind this is basically your round plate or your square plate on your palm sander is going to run along these edges and bump up against the straight edge. Now, if you want to move your juice groove out a little farther, you can put wedges in between here. Just make sure you put the same amount of wedges all the way around. But I just like the standard distance here. So what we do then is we're going to add 2 more boards to it to make it nice and tight. Alright, everything's nice and tight in there. I've left a little space, if you can see here, on both sides, and that's going to help you pull this board out with a screwdriver. So now that we're set, we're going to go ahead and cut our grooves. Now there's a couple things we need to talk about when cutting juice grooves. For a juice groove, I'm using a 3/8 inch round nose bit. And when you're cutting with these round nose bits, if you cut too deep and try to make the entire cut at one pass, it's going to be very jerky. You're going to end up with a really bad finish, and there's a chance that the router gets away from you, either stalls or cuts across the wood. So the biggest word of advice I can give you here is go down in steps. Do very shallow cuts, cutting on both sides. So what I mean is, cut a shallow cut on one side of the board, flip it over, cut that same depth on that side of the board. Now you can drop your router bit slightly, cut on one side of the board, cut on the other side of the board, and then you can step it down again till you get your final depth. This is going to give you a consistent result on both sides of the board. It also will save you a lot of sanding in the end too. So take your time, make many passes, and you'll get good results. Okay, if you went ahead with the juice groove in your board, the next thing you're going to want to do is sand this juice groove just to give you a nice finished look. Now I bought some of these contoured sanding, I don't know what they're called, pads, and what you do is you wrap your sandpaper around it. This helps you get into the grooves really nicely. It doesn't take much. The router does a real nice job, especially if you just take off a little at a time. I like to stay with the grain. So if you're going to do the sides back and forth, that's fine. But now these end pieces, I don't like to go side to side because it will leave some scratch marks. This just takes a little bit of time and some patience, depending on how nice you want it to look. We sanding stages before putting a finish on our board. What we need to do is take our sandpaper and round over the edges of the board. We've already done it with the router, but the sandpaper is going to give you a nice, smooth, natural looking rounded edge. Start to the progression of the paper with about 150 grit or so, or 120, and go through to 220 grit. So first thing we need to do is go over all the edges and take special note of the end grain. You may have some burnt areas, especially if you have older router bits or cheap router bits. They tend to burn the end grain pretty badly. So spend some time, get these nice and smooth, get rid of your burn marks. After that, we're going to move on to sanding the surfaces. It's pretty straightforward. Again, run through the grits, 150, 120 grit to 220. After that, that's about as smooth as you need these boards to be. We're on to our final step, which is also the most rewarding. I often get asked, what do you finish your cutting boards with? And my simplest solution and simplest answer is mineral oil. This can be found in your health food aisles at your grocery stores. It's good for digestion. It's great for so many things. Most importantly, it keeps the board lubricated, keeps it moist, keeps it from drying out and splitting. But it also has some other benefits. It's good for your knives. It also prevents bacteria growth. It's good for digestion. So it's great on so many levels. Some people use vegetable oil and that can break down and get rancid over time. This does not. Some people put beeswax in with your finish, which will seal it a little bit, which is fine, but I just do nice and simple with this. Now, when you give this as a gift, there's a couple things. I'm going to show you how most people do it. And when you put the oil on, you're going to want to tell everybody to put oil on it once a day for a week, once a week for a month, once a month for a year, and then every year afterwards. And then that's just to keep your board conditioned. I'm going to show you something else that I do that kind of eliminates those steps. So what we want to do is just basically take our board, put some mineral oil on it. You can get mineral oil in much smaller bottles than this. When you go to the drugstore or your grocery store, you are going to find it in pint jars, I believe. That's the most common way to find it. So this is all you're going to do is you're just going to rub it in and let it soak in. No other work to it than that. Just rub it in and let it sit there. Let me bring the camera in closer to show you what it looks like up close. Use this style of adding mineral oil to the board, you're going to have to keep coming back and adding more and more. The reason being is a lot of this wood will soak it in. These woods, especially if you use different kind of woods, they soak it in at a different rate, and all the end grain soaks in really fast too. So you want to make sure you get a good dousing of this. So I'm going to show you how I do it. I do a lot of these boards, so therefore I've found a way to kind of speed up the process and make it a little simpler. I take my mineral oil, put it in a tote. Then I just lay my board inside of it and let it soak. I like to try to keep it as covered as possible, and throughout the day I'll take and flip it a couple times. But I'll let this soak 24 hours or so, let it soak overnight. You can put the cap on it and forget about it. And especially if I have several boards, I can soak one, pull it out, soak the other, and I'll let it sit there for 24 hours in this little bath. And then when I'm ready to be done with it, I'll bring out some sticks and I'll let it drip dry for a while. Just let it sit here. Let all this oil run back off into this container, and then you can reuse it. So I'm going to let this soak, and tomorrow it's going to be, after it's dry and it's been wiped down, it's probably going to have a little oil seeping out of it, and that's fine. I'd like to have a nice lubricated moist board, something that's not going to crack on the person I give it to. So there you have it. Simple and easy way, a beautiful gift for any mother or any significant other that you can think of. And try this out. I'd love to see what you guys are doing. So if you could share a picture or come over on the forum, start a thread on cutting boards, show us what you've designed. This is a very simple one, and there's tons of other ways that you can make some boards, and I'm going to go ahead and try a few of those myself in later videos. But show me what you've been doing. I'd love to see it. I just find these to be very satisfying to make, super easy, super quick, and it really challenges your creative side because you can do just about anything with them. So until next time, I'm John from Tools in Action. Talk to you later.
Remember, for more exciting tool action, go to toolsinaction.com.